My name is Marcus. I am 42 years old, and until a crisp Thursday morning last October, I was the head chef and owner of Savannah's Grace, a critically acclaimed restaurant nestled in the heart of a rapidly gentrifying historic district. After losing my wife 3 years ago, I poured every ounce of my grief and love into that kitchen, anchoring my life to the faded pages of her handwritten recipe book. But when the building was quietly purchased by a new landlord, a woman of immense generational wealth and profound arrogance, she walked into my sanctuary and informed me that my lease was being terminated. She called the deeply complex, culturally rich menu I prepared in honor of my late wife heavy-smelling, cheap street food. She declared, with a tight, condescending smile, that my heritage did not belong in her newly acquired elite neighborhood, and that she would be transforming the space into a refined, high-class French bistro. I didn't yell. I didn't beg for my livelihood, nor did I try to educate a woman whose entire worldview was built on the assumption of her own superiority. I simply took off my apron, folded it neatly, offered her a look of profound, quiet pity, and walked out the carved wooden doors. She thought she had evicted me. She had no idea that while she prepared for a grand, million-dollar opening night to impress the city's elite, I was already holding the single, legally binding document that would dismantle her entire empire. I let her spend a fortune building a stage, only to legally pull the floorboards out from under her in front of everyone she desperately wanted to impress. Before I show you how I systematically dismantled her career and watched her arrogance collapse under its own weight, subscribe to the channel and like the video. This isn't just a story. It's a blueprint for taking your power back. The hours before dawn have always been my sanctuary. At 4 a.m., the city is nothing but a backdrop of silence, and my kitchen was the only beating heart on the block. The air inside Savannah's Grace was always thick with a profound, comforting warmth. It smelled of blooming yeast, toasted cardamom, slow-roasted garlic, and the deep, earthy richness of smoked paprika. It was a fragrance that didn't just invite you in, it wrapped its arms around you. On the stainless steel prep counter, sitting exactly where it always did, was my wife's recipe book. The leather cover was worn soft from years of use, the pages stained with olive oil and dusted with flour. Every morning, before I ignited the burners, I would rest my hand on that book. It was my daily communion, a quiet promise that her legacy was alive, breathing, and feeding the people of our community. The crown jewel of my kitchen, however, was the oven. It was a massive, custom-built stone hearth, engineered to my exact specifications. It was designed to hold a steady, rolling heat that could blister a flatbread in seconds or braise a shoulder of lamb for 12 hours without dropping a single degree. It was the absolute center of gravity in the room. I was standing in front of it, feeling the comforting, radiant heat against my face, pulling the first batch of morning bread, when the heavy oak front door of the restaurant chimed. It was entirely too early for deliveries, and the sign in the window clearly read closed. I wiped my hands on a clean linen towel and stepped out from behind the line. Standing in the center of my dining room was Olivia Carper. She was in her early 60s, wrapped in a camel hair coat that cost more than most of my staff made in a month. Her blonde hair was sprayed into an immovable helmet of perfection, and she carried a designer handbag tightly against her side, as if the very air in my restaurant might somehow tarnish the leather. The atmospheric shift was immediate. The warmth of the room seemed to retreat, replaced by the sterile, freezing draft she had carried in with her. Olivia didn't greet me. She didn't even look at me initially. Instead, she began a slow, deliberate orbit of the dining room. I stood quietly, watching the visceral physical reaction she was having to my culture. She raised a manicured hand with perfectly painted neutral nails and waved it delicately in front of her nose, her face twisting into a tight mask of disgust as the scent of the roasting spices reached her. It was a calculated, theatrical display of revulsion. She looked at the vibrant, culturally inspired artwork on the walls, pieces painted by local black artists, celebrating our shared history, with the cold, clinical detachment of an exterminator inspecting a termite infestation. When she finally turned her pale, watery blue eyes on me, I recognized the look instantly. It is a look I have endured my entire life. It is the swift, assessing sweep from the top of my head down to my chef's coat, instantly calculating my worth and placing me firmly beneath her. She wasn't looking at a master chef. She wasn't looking at a business owner who had anchored this street for nearly a decade. She was looking at a black man taking up space in a neighborhood she had suddenly decided was too good for him. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a crisp, white envelope, holding it by the very edge of her fingertips as if it were contaminated. That morning, as I stoked the oven fire, I had no idea I was about to face the greatest challenge of my life. As Olivia walked toward me, I didn't even realize that behind her haughty, contemptuous gaze, she had come not only to take my restaurant, but also my husband's legacy. The crisp white envelope she pulled from her coat pocket seemed to absorb all the light in the room. She didn't hand it to me directly. Instead, Olivia Carper took 2 measured steps toward the line, keeping a safe distance from the radiant heat of the stone hearth, and dropped the envelope onto the polished surface of a nearby dining table. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud, exactly the way a disappointed patron might leave a meager tip for a busboy. She took a slow, deep breath, not to center herself, but to performatively endure the scent of my kitchen. Her gaze swept over my worn, flour-dusted chef's coat and rested on my face. When she finally spoke, her voice was a smooth, practiced purr, coated in the kind of artificial sweetness that barely concealed the venom beneath. "Marcus, I assume," she began, not waiting for a confirmation. She knew exactly who I was. I had been the culinary anchor of this street for nearly a decade, written up in the city's major publications. Feigning ignorance of my name was the first, effortless swing of her axe. "I am Olivia Carper. My investment group has just finalized the acquisition of this building, and, quite frankly, of the entire block." I didn't speak. I simply stood behind the stainless steel counter, my hands resting lightly on the edge. In my world, silence is a tool of extraction. When you do not react, when you do not give people the emotional friction they are desperately seeking, they inevitably overplay their hand. I let the silence stretch until the ambient hum of the industrial refrigerators became the loudest sound in the room. Her thin, painted smile faltered just a fraction of an inch under my unblinking stare. She gestured vaguely toward the envelope with a manicured hand. "That is a formal notice of lease termination," she said, her tone hardening into the flat cadence of a landlord who expected unquestioning obedience. "Your current month-to-month agreement is being dissolved, effective immediately. You have until the end of the week to clear out your equipment." Most men, faced with the sudden loss of their livelihood and their sanctuary, would have felt a surge of panic. They would have rushed to the table, torn open the envelope, and frantically scanned the legal jargon. I did none of those things. I kept my eyes locked entirely on hers, analyzing the slight, triumphant flare of her nostrils. She was enjoying this. She had come here before sunrise not out of necessity, but because she wanted to watch a proud black man crumble in his own kitchen. When I still didn't speak, her impatience flared. She needed me to understand exactly why I was being discarded, to ensure I knew my place in her newly acquired world. "The demographic of this district is elevating. Marcus," she continued, taking a step closer, emboldened by my silence. "The people moving into these restored brownstones expect a certain standard of living, a certain refinement. And to be perfectly blunt, this..." She waved her hand dismissively toward the simmering pots on the stove, her nose wrinkling in genuine distaste. "This heavy-smelling, cheap street food simply does not belong here anymore. It doesn't attract the right kind of people. I am turning this space into a high-end, classical French bistro, a place where real people can come and enjoy a civilized evening." There it was. The mask hadn't just slipped. She had taken it off and thrown it on the floor. Cheap street food. The right kind of people. Real people. Every word was a calculated, racially coded strike aimed directly at my dignity and, more importantly, at the legacy of my late wife. The recipes simmering in those pots were the culmination of generations of history, crafted with techniques as complex and demanding as anything taught in a Parisian culinary academy. She wanted me to yell. She was standing there, her shoulders squared, practically vibrating with the anticipation of a confrontation. She wanted me to raise my voice, to become the aggressive, unhinged stereotype she already believed me to be, so she could call the police and have me forcibly removed. Instead, I felt a profound, almost peaceful clarity settle over my chest. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and I didn't see a powerful real estate magnate. I saw a hollow, deeply arrogant woman who believed that money could rewrite the laws of physics, let alone the laws of commerce. I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. Without breaking eye contact, I reached up and slowly untied the knot at the back of my apron. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. I pulled the heavy canvas over my head and folded it into a perfect, crisp square. I set it gently on the stainless steel prep counter. Then, I reached out and picked up my wife's worn, leather-bound recipe book. I held it close to my chest, feeling the comforting weight of it against my ribs. I walked out from behind the counter, my footsteps slow and steady against the tile floor. As I passed Olivia, I stopped. I stood a full head taller than her. I didn't glare. I offered her a soft, mournful smile, the kind of smile you give a child who is about to touch a hot stove but refuses to listen to a warning. I didn't say a single word. I walked past her, pushed open the heavy carved wooden doors of the restaurant, and stepped out into the cool morning air, leaving her standing alone in the sanctuary she had just stolen. Olivia thought she had completely crushed me when I walked out that wooden door. She thought my silence was the ultimate surrender. But in her blinding, generational arrogance, she missed something incredibly fundamental. She didn't know that in a master chef's kitchen, he doesn't just cook food, he cooks his own rules. The walk back to my brownstone was exactly 6 blocks, and I didn't rush a single step. The crisp October wind bit through my thin cotton shirt, but I barely felt it. Most people, having just been stripped of a decade of their life's work by a woman who viewed them as a sudden, unpleasant infestation, would have immediately reached for their phone. They would have called a lawyer in a blind panic, or perhaps a friend to vent their outrage. But outrage is an exhausting, useless emotion. It clouds the mind and makes you predictable. I didn't need a vent. I needed to dissect. When I unlocked my front door, the silence of my home greeted me like an old friend. I didn't throw my keys. I didn't collapse onto the sofa. I walked straight into my study, a small, meticulously organized room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The air in there always smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. I placed my wife's recipe book gently on the center of my heavy mahogany desk, tracing the embossed lettering on the cover one last time before turning on the brass desk lamp. The warm, yellow light spilled across the polished wood, illuminating the space where the real work was about to begin. I pulled out the heavy, accordion-style filing cabinet where I kept the foundational documents for Savannah's Grace. I wasn't looking for a loophole in Olivia Carper's eviction notice. Her high-priced corporate attorneys had undoubtedly drafted an ironclad, albeit morally bankrupt, lease termination based on the previous owner's month-to-month clauses. No, I wasn't looking at the building. I was looking at the kitchen itself. I spread the original permits, blueprints, and city inspection forms across the desk. When my wife and I first leased that space 10 years ago, it was nothing but an empty, echoing concrete box. To build the heart of our restaurant, I had commissioned that massive, custom stone hearth oven. It weighed over 4 tons and required specialized ventilation. At the time, the original landlord hadn't wanted the liability or the headache of dealing with the city's complex zoning board. So, I had done the legwork myself. My index finger traced down the faded ink of a crucial document from the city's Department of Health and Commercial Zoning. I stopped, feeling a slow, cold smile spread across my face in the quiet of the room. There it was. The commercial production license, the specialized thermal variance permit that allowed for high heat, open hearth cooking in that specific historic district, and the patent registration for the oven's exhaust mechanics were not tethered to the physical address of the building. Because I had paid for them entirely out of pocket, they were registered exclusively to me, to my name, and to my personal limited liability company. Olivia hadn't just bought a turnkey restaurant. She had bought a useless brick shell. Without my specific, non-transferable permits, that massive stone oven was nothing but an expensive decorative fireplace. To operate a high-end French bistro, to execute the complex, searing heat required for the elite menu she was planning, she would need that oven. And legally, that oven belonged to me. More importantly, the right to ignite it belonged to me. She assumed that because I was a black man cooking what she ignorantly labeled street food, I lacked the intellectual sophistication to protect my assets. She believed my business was held together by passion and luck, entirely unaware that I navigated commercial codes with the same absolute precision I used to break down a side of beef. If you are watching this, and you've ever had to work twice as hard just to get half the respect, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment on the video. Because this story is about what happens when you stop being polite and start keeping receipts. Stay with me. I didn't call Olivia to inform her of this catastrophic oversight. You never interrupt your opponent while they are busy making a fatal mistake. Instead, I stood up and walked over to my window, pushing the heavy curtains aside. Directly across the street from Savannah's Grace sat the old First National Bank building. It was a stunning piece of 1920s architecture, with vaulted ceilings, towering arched windows, and solid marble floors. It had been sitting vacant for 8 months, a victim of corporate downsizing. I knew the property manager, a quiet, pragmatic man who cared about reliable tenants, not neighborhood gentrification politics. By 11 a.m. that same morning, I was sitting in his office. By 1 p.m., I had signed a 10-year commercial lease for the bank building. The infrastructure was flawless, the space was twice the size of my old restaurant, and it was positioned perfectly, directly in the line of sight of Olivia's front doors. Over the next few weeks, I operated in absolute silence. I filed the paperwork with the city to legally transfer my production licenses and the operational rights of my patented equipment to my new address across the street. I didn't hire noisy construction crews. I didn't put a vibrant "coming soon" banner in the window. I simply papered over the arched glass of the old bank and began quietly building my new sanctuary behind closed doors. Meanwhile, across the avenue, Olivia's hubris was on full, deafening display. I could hear the roar of her hired demolition crews tearing out my beautiful wooden dining tables, replacing them with sterile, imported Italian marble. Delivery trucks arrived daily, unloading velvet booths and cases of vintage champagne. She was so blinded by her own elite vision, so entirely convinced that money simply erased any obstacles, that she never once sent an inspector to check the operational legality of the kitchen she had stolen. Olivia was ordering million-dollar crystal chandeliers, lining the walls with imported silk. But to understand that the heart of that spectacular kitchen actually beat with me, she would have to step onto that massive stage she built herself. From my vantage point behind the thick, brown construction paper taped over the arched glass windows of the old bank, I had a front-row seat to a masterclass in superficiality. For the next 4 weeks, the street outside was a chaotic symphony of delivery trucks and demolition crews. I spent my days in the quiet, cavernous space of my new building, methodically cleaning and prepping my newly purchased equipment, while across the avenue, Olivia Carper was busy erasing every trace of my existence. I watched her through a small slit in the paper. She was a constant, imposing presence on the sidewalk, wrapped in expensive cashmere, barking orders at her contractors. The rich, warm, culturally vibrant interior of Savannah's Grace was violently gutted. I watched workers carry out the beautiful, handcrafted wooden tables I had polished every night for a decade, tossing them carelessly into the back of a rented dumpster. In their place, massive crates of imported white marble and gaudy, velvet-upholstered chairs were wheeled in. She was spending a small fortune to sanitize the space, desperate to wash away the deep, ethnic warmth she found so offensive, replacing it with a cold, sterile imitation of Parisian luxury. This is the fatal flaw of generational wealth. When you have spent your entire life believing that money is a magical substitute for competence, you stop looking at the foundation. You assume that because you can buy the building, you automatically possess the soul of the space. Olivia had hired a team of flashy culinary mercenaries to run her new bistro. I watched them arrive one morning. 3 men in crisp, overly starched white chef's coats, carrying expensive leather knife rolls. They spent more time standing on the sidewalk, pointing at the new gold leaf signage and posing for promotional photographs, than they did inspecting the actual workflow of the kitchen. They were intoxicated by the aesthetics of the multi-million-dollar dining room, entirely oblivious to the mechanical reality waiting for them in the back. In a high-end commercial kitchen, a custom-built, 4-ton stone hearth is not a household appliance. You do not simply walk up to it and turn a dial. Because of the extreme, blistering temperatures it reaches, the city's safety department requires a specialized, heavy-duty gas line. And because I had explicitly transferred my unique production licenses and safety permits to my new address across the street, the local utility company had come out in the middle of the night and placed a heavy, tamper-proof steel lock on the commercial gas valve feeding that specific oven. I knew exactly how the scenario was playing out inside her sterile new walls. Her flashy French chefs likely saw the lock, assumed it was a minor bureaucratic holdup, and told Olivia to have her people make a quick phone call to the city to remove it. And Olivia, driven by that blinding, intoxicating arrogance, likely handed the task off to a junior assistant, entirely certain that a simple flash of her investment group's checkbook would resolve the issue. She could not fathom. Her brain was simply incapable of processing the concept that the black man she had dismissed as a purveyor of cheap street food held the absolute, non-negotiable legal rights to the very heartbeat of her new restaurant. She assumed the city would just bow to her timeline. As the weeks turned into days, her hubris reached a fever pitch. A former regular customer of mine, an elderly gentleman who had been coming to my restaurant for years, quietly slid a heavy envelope under the doors of my new building. I opened it under the glow of a single work light. It was an invitation to Olivia's grand opening. The cardstock was thick, bordered in pressed gold foil, and smelled faintly of expensive perfume. It promised the mayor, local politicians, and the absolute highest tier of the city's elite an evening of unprecedented, civilized elegance. She was laying the most elaborate, expensive trap in the world, and she was stepping right into the center of it herself. I didn't try to stop her. I didn't send a warning letter from a lawyer. I simply finished wiring my new prep stations, wiped down my stainless steel counters until they gleamed like mirrors, and waited. I brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, pulled up a single wooden stool to the front window, and peered through the narrow gap in the construction paper. When opening night finally arrived, the avenue was entirely transformed. A long velvet rope had been set up on the sidewalk. Valets were sprinting back and forth, parking a parade of sleek black town cars and expensive sports coupes. Olivia stood at the front doors, draped in an elegant silk evening gown, her blonde hair perfectly sculpted. She held a crystal flute of champagne, offering her signature tight, practiced smile as she welcomed the city's most powerful investors into her gleaming, marble-clad illusion. She looked so incredibly proud. She looked untouchable. But as she turned to gracefully usher the mayor through the carved wooden doors, she didn't realize that the 5 men in dark, unbranded windbreakers stepping out of a plain gray sedan at the end of the block were absolutely not on her exclusive guest list. I took a slow, measured sip of my coffee. The thick ceramic mug was warm against my palms, grounding me in the quiet, pristine darkness of my new dining room. Through the narrow slit in the brown construction paper covering my windows, the street outside looked like a brilliantly lit theater stage, and the opening act was about to reach its devastating climax. Across the avenue, the 5 men in the unbranded gray sedan did not wait for the valet to open their doors. They stepped out onto the cobblestone street, completely ignoring the line of luxury vehicles. They didn't walk with the hurried, anxious energy of people trying to impress high society. They walked with the heavy, unbothered, flat-footed stride of municipal authority. As they approached the entrance of Olivia's bistro, the velvet rope meant absolutely nothing to them. They unclipped it themselves, brushing past a stunned security guard who was too confused to stop them. When they stepped through the heavy carved doors, the bright, warm light of the million-dollar chandeliers spilled out onto the sidewalk, illuminating the stark contrast between the guests and the intruders. The men were wearing cheap, navy blue nylon windbreakers. Across the back, in bold white lettering, read the initials of the City Department of Health and Commercial Zoning Enforcement. Even from across the street, I could read the exact sequence of emotions playing out across Olivia's face. She had been in the middle of a delicate, performative laugh, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a prominent city councilman. When she saw the 5 men in windbreakers marching into her immaculate foyer, the laugh died in her throat. Her first reaction was pure, undiluted indignation. She assumed they were lost delivery drivers or perhaps maintenance workers who had foolishly used the front door. She excused herself from the councilman, her spine stiffening into a rigid rod of authority, and intercepted the lead inspector. She raised a manicured hand, her lips moving in a sharp, dismissive command. She was likely telling them to use the service alley. The lead inspector did not blink. He simply reached into his pocket and produced a silver badge, holding it up directly in front of her face. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't care about the elite sensibilities of the room. He spoke with the loud, projecting volume of a man who was there to enforce the law, not to mingle. Inside the restaurant, a subtle, catastrophic shift occurred in the atmosphere. The string quartet, seated on a raised platform near the bar, noticed the commotion. The cellist faltered, dragging a harsh, off-pitch note across the strings before abruptly stopping entirely. The violinists followed suit. The classical music, which had been blanketing the room in a false sense of old-world nobility, simply vanished. Without the music, the ambient noise of clinking crystal and polite laughter rapidly faded into a suffocating, heavy silence. Every single pair of eyes in that room, the mayor, the wealthy real estate developers, the politicians Olivia had spent a fortune to impress, turned toward the front door. Old money does not gasp when scandal strikes. They simply stop moving, their eyes narrowing as they silently calculate how quickly they need to distance themselves from the blast radius. The inspector pulled a thick clipboard from under his arm. I watched Olivia's perfect posture begin to fracture. She shook her head, a tight, erratic movement, her diamond earrings catching the light. She gestured wildly toward her expensive French chefs, who were now standing nervously at the edge of the dining room, holding silver trays of useless garnish. She was trying to explain that she owned the building, that she had a standard business license, that she was Olivia Carper, and this was a simple misunderstanding that her lawyers would fix in the morning. But the inspector just shook his head. He tapped his pen against the clipboard, pointing toward the back of the building. He was explaining the lock on the commercial gas line. He was informing her that the massive stone hearth oven, the absolute mechanical centerpiece required to cook the complex menu her chefs had designed, was not legally hers to operate. He was telling her that the specialized thermal variance permits, the exhaust patents, and the commercial production licenses were registered exclusively to a man named Marcus. The black man she had evicted for cooking cheap street food was the only human being in the city legally authorized to turn on that kitchen. The color completely drained from Olivia's face. The pale, expensive foundation she wore suddenly looked like a death mask. She grabbed the inspector's arm, a frantic, desperate gesture, but he firmly removed her hand. He signaled to the four men behind him. They bypassed her entirely, marching straight through the dining room, their heavy boots scuffing the imported marble floors. They pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. Less than 3 minutes later, they emerged. In their hands were thick rolls of bright, fluorescent red municipal tape. Right in front of the mayor, right in front of the city's most judgmental elite, the inspectors began pulling the red tape across the kitchen doors. They slapped massive, bright orange condemned for code violation stickers onto the polished wood. They were shutting it down. Instantly. Completely. Olivia stood frozen in the center of her multi-million-dollar illusion. She still held her crystal flute of champagne, but her knuckles were stark white, her grip trembling so violently that the golden liquid was splashing over the rim and onto her custom silk gown. She looked around the room, her eyes wide and pleading, searching for an ally. She looked at the councilman she had been charming moments before. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He simply set his half-empty glass down on a nearby table, adjusted his suit jacket, and began a quiet, brisk walk toward the exit. The mayor followed. Within seconds, it was an exodus. The guests didn't yell or complain. They just left, abandoning her in a silent wave of profound, incurable social embarrassment. They were walking out of a restaurant that couldn't legally serve them a glass of tap water, let alone a 5-course meal. I watched the last of the town cars pull away from the curb. I watched Olivia standing alone in the glow of her crystal chandeliers, the bright red municipal tape mocking her from the kitchen doors. Her generational arrogance had finally met a wall it could not buy its way through. I took another slow sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the rich, bitter warmth coat my throat. I didn't smile. I didn't feel the need to celebrate. It was simply the quiet, beautiful physics of a universe at work. An empire built on the assumption of someone else's inferiority will always, inevitably, collapse under the weight of its own ignorance. The avenue was a study in absolute, poetic contrast that evening. On the east side, Olivia Carper's grand vision sat in a suffocating, humiliating darkness. The velvet ropes drooped aimlessly against the pavement. The valet stand, just moments prior a hive of frantic activity, was entirely deserted. The city's most powerful figures, real estate magnates, politicians, and the old money elite, found themselves standing on the cold, uneven cobblestones of the historic district. They were dressed in custom tuxedos and trailing silk gowns, shivering in the crisp October wind, deeply uncomfortable and undeniably hungry. They were people accustomed to having the world handed to them on a silver platter, and instead, they had just been handed a front-row seat to an unparalleled social disaster. They didn't linger to offer Olivia their condolences. In her world, proximity to failure is a contagious disease. They simply wanted to escape the blast radius. But as they stood on the corner, waiting for their drivers to navigate the congested street, the wind shifted. It carried something far more potent than the chill of the Atlantic coast. It carried the deep, complex, unapologetic aroma of slow-braised short ribs, toasted cumin, and the sweet, earthy warmth of freshly baked sweet potato bread. It was the exact scent Olivia had wrinkled her nose at, the very culture she had dismissed as cheap and heavy. Yet, in that moment, to a crowd of abandoned billionaires whose exquisite, million-dollar dinner had just been legally condemned by the city, it was a lifeline. I didn't send out invitations. I didn't dispatch my staff to the sidewalk to hand out flyers. I simply walked over to the heavy glass doors of my new restaurant, unlatched the lock, and propped them wide open. The amber, inviting glow of my dining room spilled out onto the dark street like a beacon. I watched them cross the avenue in a slow, hesitant wave. When they stepped inside, the chill of the night instantly vanished, replaced by the profound, comforting heat radiating from my fully operational, legally permitted stone hearth. The space they entered was not wrapped in imported, sterile white marble. It was grounded in towering arched windows, exposed historical brick, and solid, reclaimed oak tables. It wasn't an imitation of an old-world aesthetic. It was authentic. It had a soul. My staff moved with flawless, silent precision. We seated the mayor, the councilmen, and the investors who had just abandoned Olivia's sinking ship. I stood behind my line, the massive oven roaring with a controlled, beautiful fire behind me, and executed the recipes my wife had spent her lifetime perfecting. When the first plates hit the tables, the room fell into a reverent, almost shocked hush. There was no polite, performative nibbling. They ate the vibrant, heavily spiced dishes with genuine, unbridled appreciation. The mayor himself asked for a second serving of the smoked paprika flatbread to soak up the rich, dark gravy of the braised lamb. They were immersing themselves in the very culture Olivia had tried so desperately to erase from the neighborhood, and they were paying a premium for the privilege. By Monday morning, the damage to Olivia Carper's empire was absolute. In the ruthless circles of high finance and high society, embarrassment is a far deadlier poison than a simple lack of funds. Her investors, horrified by the public spectacle of the red condemnation tape, pulled their backing before the stock market even opened. The massive, beautiful space she had violently gutted across the street remained locked and dark for months. Without the legal rights to the specific kitchen infrastructure, the property was essentially an incredibly expensive, decorative tomb. She quietly listed the building at a massive financial loss and retreated back to whatever insulated, gated reality she had crawled out of. She learned, at the agonizing cost of millions of dollars in her entire social standing, that a checkbook cannot purchase a legacy, and arrogance cannot simply override the law. Long after the final customer had paid their bill that opening weekend, long after my staff had polished the stainless steel counters and gone home, I stood alone in the center of my new kitchen. The stone hearth was slowly cooling down, radiating a gentle, fading warmth into the quiet room. I picked up my wife's leather-bound recipe book, running my thumb over the worn, familiar edges. The pages were safe. Her legacy was not just protected, it was elevated. It was now the beating heart of the most sought-after table in the city. People like Olivia operate under the dangerous delusion that power is about volume. They believe that if you dress loudly enough, speak condescendingly enough, and throw enough money at an obstacle, the world will simply bend to your will. But true power is never loud. True power is the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. It is not raising your voice when you are disrespected. True power is holding your boundaries with the strength of reinforced steel, knowing the rules better than the person trying to break them, and peacefully allowing their own blinding arrogance to dig the grave. By Monday morning, the damage to Olivia Carper's empire was absolute. In the ruthless circles of high finance and high society, embarrassment is a far deadlier poison than a simple lack of funds. Her investors, horrified by the public spectacle of the red condemnation tape, pulled their backing before the stock market even opened. The massive, beautiful space she had violently gutted across the street remained locked and dark for months. Without the legal rights to the specific kitchen infrastructure, the property was essentially an incredibly expensive, decorative tomb. She quietly listed the building at a massive financial loss and retreated back to whatever insulated, gated reality she had crawled out of. She learned, at the agonizing cost of millions of dollars and her entire social standing, that a checkbook cannot purchase a legacy, and arrogance cannot simply override the law. Long after the final customer had paid their bill that opening weekend, long after my staff had polished the stainless steel counters and gone home, I stood alone in the center of my new kitchen. The stone hearth was slowly cooling down, radiating a gentle, fading warmth into the quiet room. I picked up my wife's leather-bound recipe book, running my thumb over the worn, familiar edges. The pages were safe. Her legacy was not just protected, it was elevated. It was now the beating heart of the most sought-after table in the city. People like Olivia Carper operate under the dangerous delusion that power is about volume. They believe that if you dress loudly enough, speak condescendingly enough, and throw enough money at an obstacle, the world will simply bend to your will. But true power is never loud. True power is the quiet, unshakable knowledge of your own worth. It is not raising your voice when you're disrespected. True power is holding your boundaries with the strength of reinforced steel, knowing the rules better than the person trying to break them, and peacefully allowing their own blinding arrogance to dig the grave. If this reminded you of a battle you had to win in silence, share this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. I'll see you in the next story.